Good evening. We're going to jump right in and get started. Welcome all of you to the Wichita Art Museum. I'm Patricia McDonald, director here, and we are in for a great program this evening. This is a night when we are getting real bang for our buck. We're getting not one curator, but two curators giving the presentation. So we're welcoming Catherine Whitney and Christina Burke from the Philbrook Museum of Art in Tulsa. And they jointly curated the icons of Midcentury Southwest, Laura Gilpin and Maria Martinez, photography by Laura Gilpin and pottery by Maria Martinez, two women artists and then two female curators. And there are any number of synergies like that in this exhibition that I think they are going to bring to the forefront in their presentation. And I would have to say, the pairing really is exquisite in the galleries. 2D and 3D, really a subtle pairing of the black and white in the photography with some color, and then the black on black in the pottery, and then some pottery that's more polychrome. At any rate, it looks really wonderful works of art in a nice collection and combination. I would say that most good things that happen in art museums have fabulous patrons right behind, cheerleading and with generosity, very wise and civic-minded patrons. And this exhibition garnered the support of Philadelphia Fidelity Bank Foundation, and also Bill and Marilyn Oliver, who actually joined us here this evening. So applause for our exhibition sponsors. This exhibition was also one of those necessity is the mother of invention stories we learned when we were talking a little bit earlier in the day. All the work from this exhibition are part of the holdings of the Philbrook Museum. They had a gallery that they needed to fill, and rather than to sort of cast an eye across the landscape and find another exhibition that they would bring in from elsewhere, they decided that, no, we should look at our own holdings, our own collection, and see how we could pull something out of the closet, so to speak, and have that be really fabulous for our audiences. So Gilpin, the photographer Ansel Adams called one of the most important photographers of our time. That's not light praise. And Maria Martinez really is known as one of the masters of 20th century art making, and that's even without the qualifier of female artist or Native American artist. So we're in for a treat with these curators who are going to share with us the intertwining stories of these two really quite remarkable artists. So a little information on our speakers. Catherine Whitney is the chief curator as well as curator of American art. She holds sort of dual titles. Quite an accomplished early American modernist with exhibition and/or publication projects on a diverse range of subjects, including the artist Max Weber, Georgia O'Keeffe, Taos Society of Artists, and a wonderful show that I would like to know more about regarding the entire family of Wyeth artists. She worked previously at the National Gallery of Art and as well in Santa Fe at Gerald Peters Gallery. An art historian through and through, both her undergraduate degree, which was from Bowdoin College, and her master's from the University of Maryland were in art history. Christina Burke is the curator of Native American and non-Western art at the Philbrook. Quite broad expertise across so many different peoples in different areas of our country, yet her depth of research and strong research is on Lakota ledger drawings and winter counts, the Lakota being the people of the Great Plains, and she even authored a book on this subject in 2007, and I love the title, The Year the Stars Fell, Lakota Winter Counts at the Smithsonian. She spent numerous years at the Smithsonian in Washington, D.C., working on various projects, both at the National Museum of the American Indian and the National Museum of Natural History. I thought it was great. She is a jack of all curatorial trades. She was also a collection manager at the Pine Ridge Reservation in South Dakota at their Heritage Center. She holds degrees in anthropology, undergraduate from University of Rochester, and then ABD. So that's all but dissertation from the Indiana University. As you see, both quite distinguished backgrounds, and we learned today warm, lovely, spirited personalities, which I think you're going to see in their talks. Catherine will start first, sort of a two-part, and then Christina will follow her. Please help me to welcome to the podium and to Wichita both these two gracious curators.
Let's see, I'm going to turn on this light here. Thank you very much for hosting us and for that very nice introduction, Patricia. I think and assume you all know what a great gem you have here in Wichita. I know Patricia very much from her scholarship and her curatorial work, and you're very, very lucky to have her. So I just wanted to pass that along. And she's a fabulous hostess. We had a very, very nice lunch today, and she's been taking great care of us. So she's been giving us a warm Wichita welcome. Thank you. And I also wanted to extend my thanks to all of you for coming out tonight and for allowing us to share this exhibition, which Christina and I curated for Philbrook in 2012. Previously, it was titled Black on Black and White, the Southwest of Laura Gilpin and Maria Martinez. And this presentation really pairs in the first time in an exclusive museum context first time in about 4 decades, the complementary photographs and the ceramic pottery of these two iconic women artists of the Southwest who were contemporaries and friends. Laura Gilpin, as many of you know by now, was a prominent photographer of the American West. She's very renowned for her black and white images of the Pueblo and Navajo people and their deep connection to the land. Maria Martinez was of San Ildefonso Pueblo in northern New Mexico and is probably the most famous native artist of the 20th century and has been described as the matriarch of Pueblo pottery. Together with her husband, Julian, she perfected an ancient method of black on black ceramics, recreating a sleek yet refined form of Pueblo pottery for the modern era. So the idea to present this exhibition here in Wichita actually came from your previous curator, Stephen Gleisner, who saw our iteration of the exhibition in Tulsa last year. Patricia McDonald has since been, and Leslie Cervantes, have been very instrumental to the exhibition's coordination and curation in this really elegant reinstallation of the show under its new title, Icons of Midcentury Southwest, photographer Laura Gilpin and potter Maria Martinez. So given the two artists' overlapping friendship and also their mutual place of inspiration, we thought that such a pairing in an exhibition was a natural. We were fortunate to be able to pull the works from our collection of the Eugene B. Atkins collection of Western and Native American art at Philbrook that is particularly deep in women artists of the West, and we are joint stewards of that collection with the Fred Jones Jr. Museum at OU, and also from Philbrook's own permanent collection of Pueblo pottery, particularly strong in the 20th century. So add to this the chance to present a fresh feminine perspective of mid-century art of the Southwest with images and objects of the region's glorious geography with very earth-based artistic traditions, and lo and behold, our show was born. So most of us are probably more familiar with popular tropes of the American West, which cast a very stereotypic, sometimes even mythic, images onto the region as a place of rugged romance and virile conquest. We see this all over again in popular culture, stretching back to the turn of the century and ranging from posters announcing the touring extravaganza of Buffalo Bill's Wild West show to current Hollywood portrayals, most recently exemplified in Johnny Depp and Armie Hammer's comic roles in the heroic remake of The Lone Ranger, which I show you here on the bottom left. In the romantic images of the arts culture of the late 19th and early 20th century also, we see less tongue-in-cheek but no less outwardly masculine portrayals of the Western frontier that were popularized in paintings by Charlie Russell that you are all very familiar with here, which you're fortunate to have such a strong collection, Frederick Remington, or by Taos Society artists such as Oscar Burninghouse, as I show you an example here from Philbrook's collection. Many of the Taos Society paintings won prestigious painting awards during their days in the early 1900s, and they were often illustrated in serialized publications. Others were reproduced on popular travel calendars that were strategically illustrated and produced by marketing executives of the Santa Fe Railway Company to stimulate tourism to the region. In contrast to this more visible imagery, Christina and I really sought to contribute something a little bit more inclusive to the history and the historic dialogue of the Southwest through an overlapping earth-based presentation of elegant objects by these pioneering women. If you've had the opportunity to view the exhibition, which I hope you have, you'll see the show is loosely divided into thematic categories that explore various motifs of landscape, people, process or art making, and legacy. So before delving into these particular sections and then also the individual objects, I'll take a quick look, as Patricia said first, at Laura Gilpin and the exhibition's two sections relating to her photos of landscape and people. And then I'll pass the mic over to Christina, and she'll continue elaborating on Maria Martinez, her story and method and legacy. So Laura Gilpin was born in Austin Bluffs, Colorado, which is just outside of Colorado Springs, in 1891. She was born to a cultured mother from St. Louis and a wannabe cowboy dad named Frank from Baltimore. Her father earned a pretty unstable living making furniture and wandering from ranching job to miscellaneous job venture. It was his daughter, Laura, who was the really entrepreneurial and adventuresome spirit of the family. And she would actually eventually help her dad financially despite her very humble earnings. Gilpin, always the entrepreneur, supplemented her fine arts career mostly as a commercial portrait and architectural photographer, but she also had stints as a magazine illustrator, a 4-time book publisher, and even a gourmet turkey farmer during the difficult Depression years. She was given a Kodak Brownie camera for her 12th birthday and a developing tank for Christmas that same year in 1903, and she began experimenting almost immediately. Her first attempts to focus her artistic eye came from an early experience at the St. Louis World's Fair in 1904. She was tasked by her mother to take a family friend who was blind through the exposition, and she practiced seeing for both of them and offered vivid descriptions of the exhibitions, and perhaps maybe even was narrating to herself her future direction. Another childhood influence that left a lasting impression upon Gilpin was this photographic print of Navajo Riders in the Canyon de Chelly by Western Romantic photographer Edward Curtis. Gilpin recounts that this print actually hung in her father's living room, and she remembers staring up at it as a child many times and just wondering where on earth there were rocks like that and where on earth there were actually people like that. She would spend her next 6 decades of her career chasing these childhood daydreams and documenting these discoveries on film. In 1915, Gilpin photographed extensively at the Panama Pacific Exposition in San Francisco and San Diego. And interestingly, Maria Martinez and Julian Martinez were both there attending as exhibitors demonstrating their Native American pottery techniques, but it's unknown if the two women met at this early juncture. So Gilpin's first published photograph was an image of the Grand Canyon that dated to about 1916, and this was a time when the National Park Service was being established by President Woodrow Wilson, and when national monuments were starting to become part of the public consciousness. This was also the year that Gilpin entered the Clarence White School of Photography in New York on the advice of a very early mentor, Gertrude Casebier. Casebier was once praised by the leading she was once praised as the leading portrait photographer of the day by modern art champion and fine arts photographer Alfred Stieglitz of New York. And many of you may know Alfred Stieglitz as the famous husband of Georgia O'Keeffe and the fine art dealer and champion of her art, as well as many early American modernists. As a founding member of his famous photo succession group, Quesabier was later rejected by Stieglitz, basically for her embrace of both fine art and commercial photography as a viable career option for women, which he encouraged many artistic women to pursue. He was very much of a fine art purist and didn't believe mixing fine arts with commercial arts. In addition to her very well-known portraits and domestic scenes, Quesabier created intimate studio portraits of Lakota and Sioux Indians she encountered in New York City in 1898, who were there as part of Buffalo Bill's Wild West traveling troupe. While these images are very sympathetic, they do really decontextualize the sitters by placing them in this Anglo artist's New York studio. Furthermore, these intimate portraits were often veiled by very popular pictorialist conventions of the day, which really tried to emulate on film these romantic effects of turn-of-the-century painting, because photography at this time was trying to sort of compete with painting. Whether Gilpin would consciously appropriate Quesabier's subjects or not, her own native subjects would later evolve a greater sense of modernity and authenticity, particularly after 1930. This was likely due to changing market trends and aesthetic tastes in photography at the time, but also very much probably due to Gilpin's conscious inclusion of a sense of community and place in her future native portraits, as we'll see very shortly. So Gilpin did follow Quesabier's advice, and she went to New York and enrolled at the Clarence White School of Photography in New York City from 16 to 1918. Max Weber, who was America's first cubist, was her most important teacher there. Weber, like Quesabier, had studied under the influential turn-of-the-century arts educator Arthur Wesley Dow. And Weber furthered Dow's philosophies by teaching Gilpin and her fellow photography students about very popular Japanese aesthetic principles of design, harmony, and flat two-dimensional, of simplicity, harmony, and two-dimensional design. Weber also really espoused an appreciation for historic cultures of the world. And as an aside, I wanted to mention that last fall, Philbrook mounted a retrospective exhibition of Max Weber's figural production. And we called it Models and Muses, Max Weber and the Figure. And we were thrilled to have this really powerful 1939, I'm sorry, that image is a little blurry, from your Murdoch collection, which is really a wonderful piece. So thank you for lending that. So now back to Gilpin. So from the school's founder, Clarence White, Gilpin learned photographic techniques, specifically the platinum printing method, which was a very complex process that yielded these very beautiful soft grays and velvety rich blacks. Gilpin would become famous later in her life for her role in reviving this process, this platinum printing process, which fell into obscurity in the 1920s, largely due to a lack of availability of these materials as silver techniques moved into popularity. The highly complicated platinum process, which involved hand-coating fine art papers, was the perfect technical complement to the then very popular photographic style of pictorialism. Some of Gilpin's earliest landscapes from this exhibition, such as Playground at Day School, Colorado Springs, and Sleeping Ute, Mesa Verde, exemplify Gilpin's early pictorial style, which, as I said, she learned from Clarence White. Characterized by these very soft, focused, tonal effects, pictorialism was very popular at the turn of the century, and it tended to present these subjects and scenes through this hazy lens of romanticism. Both Clarence White and Quesabier founded the Pictorial Photographer of America group in 1916, and this group would sponsor Gilpin's first New York show in 1924. It might be safe to say that pictorialism placed a greater emphasis on how than on what, and on style maybe even more than subject. And I show you a couple examples of Gilpin's early pictorialist landscape. So again, they're characterized by this overall sort of suffused romanticism, sort of undifferentiated masses. Sometimes you'll have a very low horizon on the landscapes, and the overall, that's this very kind of poetic and dreamy feel to the work. Gilpin's post-1930 photographs, while generally printed in silver techniques and much later in colors, you'll see in the exhibit, moved towards a greater clarity and complexity, both compositionally and spatially. We see this in Gilpin's characteristic fine range of detail and wide range of field. This move towards a more modern or straight style, as it's called, mirrored wider stylistic and technical changes in American photography circles, particularly after Platinum's demise. The stylistic shift also subtly affected Gilpin's choice of subjects. While Gilpin always photographed the regional landscapes and architectural subjects, her choices seemed to become even more about region and about place as her pictorialist style faded and the details of what she saw and presented came into sharper focus. So let's look now at the section of the exhibition that highlights Gilpin's focus on the Western landscape. One of Gilpin's greatest passions was her love of her homeland, which was the American West. She once said that she would much rather live in the West than be poor and deal with a rat race in New York City. Photography great Ansel Adams once described Gilpin's character using the metaphor of the Western landscape. He wrote this great quote, and he said, "Add to this a determined twinkle, a gregarious intensity, and a personal glow, which seems to come from the stored-up shining light on mesas, canyons, vast skies, thunderclouds, Navajos, and pinon trees. All this is part of Laura Gilpin, one of the important photographers of our time." So Gilpin would trek great distances by foot, by jeep, and even by plane to these very remote locations in passionate pursuit of these inspiring views. She would often heft her heavy 8x10 camera over her shoulder, chasing these dramatic weather patterns or these uninterrupted scenic expanses. Gilpin frequently told an airplane pilot friend of hers, she would say, fly lower, in her passionate pursuit of the perfect aerial shot for work such as Upper End of the Canyon de Chelly or Navajo Farms in the Canyon de Muerto from the air from 1952. Her pilot friend once joked that if she leaned too far out trying to get the perfect shot, that she would probably shoot photographs all the way to the ground, that she was that insistent and obsessed with getting the perfect shot. She was really a true adventurer and really was quite unbound by physical risk and societal restrictions at this time and pursued her passion well into her 80s. Gilpin connected her love of landscape to the thrill of flight. She wrote in 1968, "Perhaps it's my love for landscape and geography that makes me want to fly. From the air, one can see so clearly the great structures of the Earth's surface, the different kinds of mountains, the sweep of contours, the age-old erosion. In the air, one becomes attached, and the mind goes deep into the past, thinking of time in depth." We see this sense of time and its effects on the land and these powerfully carved cliffs and these arroyos and waterways that meander through her composition, particularly in the Canyon de Chelly piece. Gilpin was hard at work on her fifth book project, a major photographic study of this famous canyon well into her 80s, even weeks before her death in 1979. She completed 3 other major book projects on cultural, architectural, and geological themes in the 1940s, which was sort of her great era of book publishing. And then in the late 60s, published her magnum opus, The Enduring Navajo, which we'll speak more about very shortly. Gilpin's comfort with airplanes and aerial adventure likely stemmed from her work during World War II as the chief photographer at the Public Relations Department at Boeing here in Wichita. It was here from 1942 to 45 where she documented the introduction of the B-29 Super Fortress with much drama and glory, and she did this during 5 different assignments. So her brief stint as an industry photographer yielded this best-known version of this photograph, which shows this plane kind of on the shimmering wet tarmac coming out of the hangar, which years later was actually enlarged for the Time Life building in New York and made into a mega mural there. After the war, Gilpin moved to Santa Fe, where she lived until her death in 1979. In a field that had traditionally been championed by men, Gilpin was one of the first women photographers to capture remote aspects of the Western landscape on film and to comment, both in her imagery and in her writings, upon the interconnectedness of humankind and the environment. Famous 19th century predecessors like Western survey photographers William Henry Jackson, whom she actually met and was very distantly related to, Timothy O'Sullivan and Carlton Watkins forged photographic explorations of the West with a scientific eye for magnificence. Romantic photographers like Edward Curtis portrayed Native Americans of the Western frontier as a vanishing race. Later, 20th century contemporaries like Ansel Adams or even Georgia O'Keeffe, the painter, presented the Western landscape as an unpeopled place of pristine and isolated beauty. Gilpin, by contrast, really presented her landscapes as geological sites that were marked by this sense of evolving human activity. As her biographer, Martha Sandweiss, has written, quote, "For Gilpin, the Southwest landscape was neither an empty vista awaiting human settlement nor a jewel-like scene resisting human intrusion. It was a peopled landscape with a rich history and tradition all its own, an environment that was shaped and molded by the lives of its inhabitants." Which brings us to the next section of the exhibition, a focus on the people. So while Gilpin considered herself a landscape photographer, her photographs that chronicle the Pueblo and Navajo people of the Southwest are really probably her most important works. Like other photographers who documented the American scene during the 20s and 30s, Gilpin's very intimate and arresting portraits capture humanity and changing life conditions in rural America. Gilpin's lens, however, was focused on the slice of American life she came to know among the Pueblo and Navajo reservations in the Southwest. So I just showed you this map here, the Four Corners area, that includes northern New Mexico, southern Colorado, Utah, and northeastern Arizona on the Navajo reservation, where she focused much of her life's work. Gilpin's first exposure to the area came in the early 1920s during camping trips through New Mexico and Colorado, which began to deepen her interest in the traditions and lifeways of the Pueblo people. Gilpin's early photographic records of the Pueblo Indians paralleled a larger fascination with the area during the 19-teens and the 1930s, one that brought many artists and collectors, anthropologists, and ethnologists to New Mexico to document these compelling cultures. Like many portrayals of the period, Gilpin's early Indian portraits represented her Native American subjects as stoic, romanticized types, much like the painted portraits from the Tau Society of Artists. And I show you on the left here Joseph Henry Sharp's Chief Little Wolf that's in Philbrook's collection and hangs in our founder, Wade Phillips's Santa Fe room on the lower level at Philbrook. Gilpin's 1932 portrait is a bit of a transitional work in that it's done in a silver technique, which was sort of a later medium, but it does make an interesting comparison. It really sort of evokes these formal and romanticized aesthetic strategies that a lot of the painters did from this era. And you'll notice the work in the upper right corner from 1925 really more directly illustrates this very romanticized, almost staged portrayal of a Pueblo woman, much like you'd see in the kind of outdated Natural History Museum display. This sort of out-of-reach, exotic woman is literally framed, almost confined by her ancient surroundings. And by contrast, Gilpin's work from 1950 below is a much crisper, more individualized group portrait. It demonstrates Gilpin's eventual move towards a more sympathetic snapshot or kind of real American life image that was tinged with very human subjects as well as very contemporary concerns. So it's from the 1930s onward that Gilpin discovered the Diné, or the people of the earth, of the Navajo lands of New Mexico and Arizona. She discovered them quite by accident when she and her dear friend and travel companion, Betsy Forester, were on a multi-day driving trip and camping trip. Their car ran out of gas on this very remote stretch of Arizona desert. So Gilpin left to find help, and she left Forester with the car. Gilpin returned a couple hours later and found Betsy Forester engaged in a card game with some local Navajos that had come to her aid. The following year, which was 1931, Forester returned to serve as a field nurse at the Red Rock Trading Post on the Navajo Reservation, where she worked for 2 years, till 33. And as an aside, Gilpin had actually met Betsy Forester way back in 1918. When she was in New York, she contracted the Spanish flu, which was this huge, historic epidemic that killed about 50 million people, and O'Keeffe actually almost died from that at the same time. And so her parents hired Betsy Forester to be her private nurse, and once Gilpin recovered, their friendship remained, and they remained lifelong friends and companions. So the two women, Gilpin would come visit Forester on the reservation quite regularly, and the two women really formed lasting relationships with the locals, who became Forester's neighbors and patients and Gilpin's subjects. They learned a lot about the Navajos' traditional reliance on the land, as well as the changes they faced during the mid-20th century's period of modernization. Such concerns became the theme of Gilpin's most celebrated subjects and the focus of her fourth book, which I mentioned previously, The Enduring Navajo, which actually took her 18 years to complete. Many of the photographs in this exhibition are part of that magnum opus of hers, including this photograph in the, see if I can get the pointer right, top left here, which I apologize is not a very good image, but it's a scan of the cover of the book and also one of the photographs in the exhibition that is a young Navajo family. This portrait, while others, like the previous image of the Navajo woman holding the child and the lambs in her arms, might be seen as Gilpin's hopeful and Navajo equivalent of Dorothea Lange's migrant mother, as they do also reflect Gilpin's deep understanding of the Navajo culture. For example, the Navajo economy was largely based on sheep, and as we saw the mother holding the lambs along with her own baby was sort of a subtle reference to tradition, sustenance, and future. Also, the Navajos placed a strong value on a sense of family and maternal ties. In fact, the lineage is actually passed through the mother, and the boys are the ones who carry the dowry, interestingly. And they're actually forbidden to speak to their mother-in-law, which I found both convenient and wise. Good marriage counseling. And in this way, Gilpin's photographs are not just documentary, but they're deeply sympathetic and very socially informed. Her work from this period references lasting tradition and encroaching modernity. And as the title of her book implies, she saw her subjects as adapting and enduring, not vanishing, like Edward Curtis's portrayals. Here's one of my favorite Gilpin photographs of women returning from a trip to the trading post, which shows this eloquent mixing, I think, of old ways and the subtle introduction of modern change. Just to point out some of the formal characteristics, because Gilpin was a consummate craft person and really cared about her compositions. So here in the foreground, we have three women, Navajo women on foot, kind of wrapped in their traditional Navajo blankets coming back from the trading post. There's a lot of this kind of triangular imagery in here, just formally, with this fence post jutting out here, and also reiteration here with the peak and even the cloud formation here. So she's not just a documentary photographer, she's an artist. She's also referencing modes of transportation here with foot travel, the mule, the carriage in the back. Sometimes the trading posts were far out of the way, so you had to take a carriage to get to them. And then I think you can see it here very subtly. There are tire tracks in the dirt here, which sort of references automobiles and the kind of mixing of these old and new ways. As I've said, as Gilpin's friendship with the Dene deepened, her photographs modernized. Just as her style shifted from pictorialist to straight photography, as we discussed in relation to landscape photography, so too did her photographic portraits become more documentary in nature, reflecting real-life people and the relationships she experienced versus cultural assumptions and stereotypes. I touched on this a minute ago in relation to the woman from Mesa Verde and the Navajo family from 1950, seen here on the right. This same family, the Nakai family, has a really poignant story which illustrates Gilpin's stylistic evolution over time and mirrors larger aesthetic trends in the field. But I think even more significantly, perhaps, it really illustrates Gilpin's deepening relationships and knowledge of her sitters. So these two photographs, one from 1932 in this platinum style, shows Mrs. Francis Nakai. Francis was actually the father, the husband, and Mrs. Francis, they never even knew her first name. She didn't speak English very well, but she was a dear friend of Betsy's and was always over there for coffee when Laura came to visit. And she had this little boy, one was Juan and one was Louis, in 1932 when they were living on the Navajo reservation. When money ran out, Betsy got transferred back to Colorado and various things happened. Fallout from the Depression happened, and they were turkey farming and doing various things, and the war happened. So Gilpin came back a few times over a long period of time, but then really later wanted to come back and document these same people that she could find and their situation. So in 1950, she came back and saw Mrs. Francis, they called her sometimes, who had actually joined them in Santa Fe. She brought them, Betsy and Laura brought Mrs. Nakai to Santa Fe to a rug exhibition at the Indian Arts Fund. And she came back, and they were living in the same small house, but look at the completely different portrayal we have here from 1950. So this is Mrs. Nakai in the center looking out at you, and one of the very few decorations in the room is this American flag in the back that actually had draped the coffin of either this son or his brother who had died in World War II, and that had draped his coffin when he was buried in France. So you have this much more real-life portrayal of tragedy in America, and something that, as Christina was pointing out today when we were walking through, really it wasn't just a Native family, it was an American family, and we were all dealing with the same tragedies and the same contemporary events. So I think it's an interesting comparison because you can see the stylistic evolution as well as the kind of emotional evolution and social evolution of the artist. I think the greatest example of the social understanding of her sitters came through Gilpin's portrayal of her friend and one of her most famous sitters, Maria Martinez, the master potter of San Ildefonso Pueblo. Gilpin befriended and photographed Martinez along with members of her Pueblo community and family for many years. It was this friendship and the two artists' common connection with earth-based and earth-inspired art, which is really the unifying link in this show. So with this, let me ask Christina Burke to come up and share her deep knowledge of Maria Martinez, her method, and her legacy.
Thank you. And I hope with what we're presenting and talking with you about tonight, if you have already seen the exhibition, I hope the information and perspective we provide you gives you fresh eyes to look at the exhibition again as you go through the gallery. So Catherine has talked a bit about Laura Gilpin and the sections about landscape and people. I'm going to talk about Maria Martinez and her process and her legacy as well. Just a bit about process in terms of Laura Gilpin's photographs. She not only photographed Maria Martinez and her family making pottery, but Navajo and Pueblo artists doing all kinds of creative things. This is actually Maria Martinez baking bread in a traditional horno oven behind her adobe house at San Ildefonso Pueblo. A Navajo jeweler working on a mold of silver at his bench in his traditional hogan. Two Navajo women sewing. There's a sewing machine there in the middle of their traditional hogan. And you see all kinds of fabrics and textiles hanging up on the wall. There's a weaving as well as manufactured textiles, and they're working with velvet or velveteen, which has become a traditional material for Navajo clothing. So Laura Gilpin documented all of these artists involved in creative processes. And weaving in particular, and again, Catherine has spoken about Gilpin's relationship with Navajo people, with the landscape, and the importance of sheep to their lifeway and economy. We see again that picture of the Navajo woman with her child and these little lambs, and she is literally holding her legacy and the future of her family and community in her hands. Sheep were introduced by the Spanish, actually. They're not indigenous to North America. So there's an interesting sort of transition and introduction to modernity. But the Navajo quickly began herding sheep, carding their wool and creating these beautiful textiles, also eating mutton as sustenance. And as Catherine mentioned, the Navajo are matriarchal, so sheep are owned by the women. And so You see women with the little lambs, but also shepherds in the landscape. And again, examples of Gilpin, not those pristine, unpeopled landscapes, but Native people and their environment. We also see some really focused images of Navajo people spinning yarn, a close-up of a weaving, and then a famous Navajo weaver, Daisy Togolchi, at her loom set up outside her house. But perhaps Gilpin is best known for documenting pottery making by Maria Martinez and 3 generations of her family. Pottery making among the Pueblo people is an ancient art form. Historically, women made the pots and men painted them. That was kind of the art making along gender lines. But it really was an entire family process. There are certain places where people find the kinds of clay that they use for these creative endeavors. You don't just go to Michael's or Hobby Lobby and buy a bunch of clay. You have to know the right place to go to get that clay. You bring it home, you process it, clean it up, you might add some temper to it, then you form it into these bowls. You dig a pit in behind your home to fire it up. You don't put this in a kiln and then just simply turn a dial up to a certain temperature. You have to build the fire. You've got to tend that fire. It might take days to get the fire up to just the certain temperature that it needs to be to harden that clay, and then very carefully bring that temperature down again so that there's not what's called a thermal shock, in which the pottery would break if there's too quickly a change in temperature. If anybody's taken something out of the oven and put cold water in it too quickly, that's a thermal shock when you break your ceramics that way. Polishing the pot, as we see Maria doing here, and painting the pot. This is Maria's son, Popova Day, painting a pot. So a very complex, multi-stage process that involved the entire family. And that Gilpin photographed over a period of over 30 years, so more than 3 decades. Now, there are 3 basic kinds of pottery styles that Maria and her family made and that her relatives and other community members in San Ildefonso continue to make. Polychrome or multicolored pottery, we see examples of that in this exhibition. That's really a very standard, historical, traditional kind of pottery that many Pueblo people continue to make and have made for thousands of years. This unique gunmetal gray pottery, it doesn't show up very well in PowerPoints, but there is a case in the exhibition with 3 examples of gunmetal gray pottery, and you can really see the difference in it. Incredibly shiny surface, reflective surface, almost a mirror-like quality to it. And the way that's accomplished is that it's what we call over-fired. That fire pit that you build and then stoke with wood, the fire has to get to above 1,200 degrees Fahrenheit or thereabouts to get that gunmetal quality. And then what Maria became best known for, she and her husband Julian and other family members, was this black-on-black pottery. And here, you not only have to burnish or polish the pot, as we saw Maria doing in one of those other photographs, it's then painted with slip, which is basically the same kind of clay that you use to make the pot. You just add more water to it. So it's a more watery form of the same clay. You paint over that polished surface. So these shiny surfaces are not glazes like we're familiar with in our ceramics. It's elbow grease. It's polish, 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 burnish, burnish, burnish. Then you overpaint, you pit fire it, and at a certain point, and I don't know what that point is, but at a certain point in the firing, you completely cover the fire with either cow or sheep manure. These are cow or sheep patties, probably cow based on the size of them. You smother that fire and it produces a thick black smoke which penetrates that clay. Otherwise, you have, sort of the grayish or reddish clay that you see in other examples in the exhibition. Now, this kind of black-on-black pottery that Maria and Julian became famous for in the early 20th century, it was traditional among Pueblo people thousands of years ago. But the knowledge of how to create it had been lost for a long time. Maria's husband, Julian, was not only helping her on pottery, but he was working with an anthropologist at a museum in Santa Fe who was excavating these old potsherds and finding this black-on-black pottery. And he would ask people like Julian and Maria and other artists, how do you guys make this black-on-black pottery? And they said, we don't know. Our ancestors made it, but we don't make it anymore. And he said, well, this is pretty neat stuff. You guys should figure out how it's made. And Maria and Julian experimented with different kinds of clay, different firing temperatures, and as I said, eventually came up with this smothering technique, and their work became very popular, and not just in Santa Fe, but really around the world. Not only in terms of the black-on-black pottery, but various shapes and imagery. I'll go a little bit more into that. But again, although they became famous for the black-on-black pottery, Maria and her husband Julian, their family members, son Popova Day, and others, created various shapes, sizes, and styles of pots. Some were painted, some were not, some were polished, etc. So there's really quite a wide range of kinds of pottery that they made. As I said, this sort of reddish pottery that we see in these two pieces, it's exactly the same kind of clay that makes these black pieces. The only difference is in that firing process at the very end when you smother the fire. Just a couple of examples of design elements that we see on this pottery, and again that Maria and Julian and their family became famous for. This sort of dragon-like figure we see here on this plate by Tony Day is known as a Vanya. And this is a feathered serpent, a mythical being that Pueblo people believe lives in the Southwest, and he is the bringer of water. And if you look closely at his tongue, there's this zigzaggy lightning bolt figure, and Pueblo people believe that's where lightning comes from, is when a Vanya flicks his tongue out from his mouth. That creates lightning. And at the very end, his large tail, when it slaps on the ground, that's what creates thunder. Now you can imagine living in the desert Southwest, water's a really important element, and you're actually thankful for it when you see that lightning and hear that thunder. This is a good thing. It means our crops are going to grow, it means our sheep have water, it means we have water. So a Vanya is a very powerful creature and a very desirable and powerful element that we see in paintings from the early 1900s on Pueblo kilts as part of a dance ceremonial outfit. And this stylized feather design that Maria also became famous for has ancient roots as well. This is a Mimbres bowl from the Southwest from about 1250 AD. Very abstract and I think very modern looking to our eyes. So again, she and her husband were looking to the past and looking to these traditions of pottery making and these designs that have meaning for their family and for their community, but bringing them into the 20th century. Like Laura Gilpin, Maria and her husband traveled all over the country and not only attended, but demonstrated and were exhibitors at various World's Fairs. And again, St. Louis and San Diego were the first two where they exhibited. We don't have any documentation that they connected with Laura Gilpin there, but they seem to live these parallel lives in some ways, and then later connected in Santa Fe and became lifelong friends. One of the things that I think is so interesting about this history of Maria and Julian, again, their pottery making, and particularly the black on black, became so well known, not just because people would come to Santa Fe to see their work, but they traveled to these urban centers where people had never seen Pueblo artists before. So imagine St. Louis, San Diego, Chicago. This is from the Chicago World's Fair, and you see Maria and Julian demonstrating here, and San Francisco. So they brought their artwork to American urban centers. And in fact, you can find Maria's work not just in places like the Philbrook and the Smithsonian, but in fact in New York at MoMA and at the Art Institute in Chicago as well. She really has been recognized as an American artist, not just a Native artist or just a woman artist. And over the years, Laura Gilpin photographed, again, Maria and her family. We see a couple of decades going by in these portraits here, where she's polishing a pot, holding a piece inside her home, and then standing outside her home in San Ildefonso Pueblo in New Mexico. But Gilpin also photographed the family, and these were not only family members, but artists in their own right with whom Maria collaborated over the years. So here's Maria and her son, Popova Day, with a piece they collaborated on. And this wonderful little picture here is Maria's grandson, Tony Day, getting ready to participate in his first dance at San Ildefonso Pueblo, and then 22 years later, again, he became an artist in his own right. So we see Maria and her family evolve, change, grow over the years. We see their artwork grow as well. So she really documented their family and their artwork over a long period of time. So Maria's legacy is not just the art that she created, but that knowledge of process and art making that she shared with her husband, with her son, Again, here's her and Popova Day, her son, grandson Tony Day, and each subsequent generation really developed their own style. Again, although Maria was known for a lot of this very polished, shiny, elegant black pottery, she and her son Poe would often collaborate on these very colorful polychrome pots. And Popova Day, you'll see this pot here, this is known as a black and sienna pot. And that technique was invented and perfected by Tony Day. He would fire this, smother the fire to get that shiny black effect, and then he would take a blowtorch and overfire just this one stripe to get that sienna and kind of turn the clay back to a much lighter color. So things don't just turn dark when you fire them again and again. Sometimes you can turn them back to a lighter color. So he took his mother's legacy and that knowledge of process and pottery making and put his own spin on it. Now, when we get to the third generation of Tony Day, so Maria's grandson and Poe's son, he not only would do this overfiring technique, but he also started etching. In a lot of, let me see if I can go back just a minute here. When we look at the black on black ware, we see this contrast of the very shiny polished surface and the matte finish, or that kind of flat where it's been overpainted with slip. Well, Tony took that idea of those contrasts between the shiny and the matte, and what he did was to etch a surface to get that contrast of texture and color and lightness. So he again took that legacy from his grandmother and his father and made it his own. Now, Tony's son, Jared Day, is not a potter, but he is an artist in his own right. And he's a painter and draftsman, if you will. This is a piece of Jared Day's that Philbrook recently acquired, a pastel drawing of his, and next to a painting of his father's that we have from 1968. So that legacy continues to today. There are other relatives of the family in San Ildefonso, Pueblo, and other places in New Mexico who continue the pottery making tradition as well. And of course, the legacy is also documented in all kinds of books, not just exhibitions, but lots of people over the years have written about Maria's work and her influence not just on Pueblo artists, but Native art in general. And again, think about the experience of Maria and Julian traveling to St. Louis, to San Diego, to Chicago, and the experience of those visitors who would come to see them and experience Native culture and Native art for the first time. Her influence really is still being felt today in the Native art world. And just recently, there was a show of work by Tony Day, her grandson, at the Museum of Indian Arts and Cultures in Santa Fe. So we've looked a bit at landscape and people, process, and legacy. And again, I hope that Catherine and I have provided you some new information and insight to see the exhibition with fresh eyes. And with that, we'll be happy to answer questions or make up answers if we don't know what we're talking about. You want to come back up? Does anyone have any questions, or have we told you more than you ever wanted to know about these two women? Yes, sir.
In the feather work that she did, how did she get that so even?
I'm not sure. She did not use a stencil to make them all exactly the same. And if you go and look at the pieces, you'll see variations. But I think that she did use guides to sort of steady her hand. And sometimes you'll see painters, particularly if they're working on murals or large-scale painters, holding something that will sort of act as a guide for them to make straight lines. But like Gilpin, Maria Martinez really was not only an incredible craftsperson, but a perfectionist. And even with the firing technique, with painting, with finding the right clay, with processing it, she was a perfectionist. She wanted everything to be just right. And just imagine after you've gone out and dug up this clay and made it exactly the right consistency and the right temper, you've made this piece, you fired it, and it cracks in the pit fire. I mean, then you have to start all over again. It may take weeks. The care, the artistry, the love, and the tradition that goes into making these pots are something that I admire, but I don't truly understand because I don't have the patience or the creative spirit for it. Yes?
When they do the polishing at the leather stage.
That's right. And actually, the pots, as they dry, go through various stages. And when you're doing the polishing, the leather stage, it's not quite set. It's not too dry. If it's too dry, you'll just crack the pot and it'll break before you've even gotten to the pit firing. And sometimes if the pot gets too dry, you actually add slip to it, not just water, straight water, but slip. So you've added a bit of clay, a lot of water, and you have to moisten it up again to polish, and get that incredible sheen and shine to it.
In the 1970s, my art students at the youth center we actually did this whole process.
Ah.
And we dug the clay, we processed the clay, and we made little pots.
Mm-hmm.
They were, I've been to San Alfonso.
Mm-hmm.
Huge pot. They're really big ones.
Yes.
And make the little pots, and then they had the reality of listening to the instructions, and if they didn't follow, crack.
Yeah.
And they had to start over again. But it was very good. And then we weren't able to, you get some of the bloom where it's been, the oxygen's been cut off. But most of our pots turned out with more of the reddish,
Mm-hmm.
not really dark red, but
And-
buff color with the dark in it.
Mm-hmm.
But anyhow, that was very, 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 very nice because they did turn out very nice.
It's a complex process. And the bloom you mentioned, or fire cloud, it can affect the surface of the pot if there are different temperatures in that pit fire. Again, it's not that everything is even when you put it in a kiln and you turn the dial. You've got to build that fire just right. You've got to tend it, keep an eye on it. The weather affects it. If it's too windy, you might have to build a windbreak. If it's not windy enough, you've got to fan the flames. It's a very labor-intensive process.
We had to use a barbecue grill, but we did very well, and I think they'll never forget that.
I bet. Was there another question? Yes.
You may have mentioned this, or I just missed it, but where did Maria learn all that she learned?
I didn't mention it. So she came from a family of artists, actually. And many Pueblo women make pottery. Her mother and aunts made pottery as well. As I mentioned, among Pueblo people, women made pots and men traditionally painted them. So it really was a collaborative effort. You'd work with your husband or your brothers or your cousins. But her mother and a couple of aunts were all potters as well. So she grew up in a family where she would go out with these elder relatives to dig the clay. So she knew where to go to get the good stuff. And again, it's a family process. You'd help digging the pit in the backyard, and the kids would gather wood, maybe even the cow chips, Everybody was involved in various ways, and involved in the polishing as well. So you grew up kind of learning the various aspects of it, as did she. Absolutely. Absolutely. Pottery among Pueblo people is utilitarian as well as an artistic endeavor. So yes, things were and still are used within the community, but particularly since the Spanish came, used for trade, and even trade to the Navajo neighbors as well, used for trade and for sale. And right about the time Maria and Julian were coming up with, rediscovering this black on black ware, there was a real tourist boom in Santa Fe. I mean, think about the railroad coming out and people from back east or cities like Chicago or LA saying, well, we're going to take our vacation, we're going to go see this great place where we've seen photographs of this incredible landscape, and we're going to go there and buy these pots. So yeah, a lot of these were made for sale, absolutely. Yes?
Piece that was on an earlier slide made about 1250
Yes.
versus what she has created.
Mm-hmm.
Like you said, that piece, that hole still had, well, I couldn't see the age patina to it at all.
Mm.
Same as with hers. I mean, is it, in those samples, are we talking locked-in times for us at that stage, or they?
Well, pottery is very durable, and particularly in the desert Southwest, if you don't have the elements of water in particular working on it, it's going to last forever. Once pottery has been fired, it's incredibly durable. For those kinds of pots, the 1250 pot, that was from the Mimbres culture, an ancient culture, native culture of the Southwest. A lot of those kinds of pots that we're familiar with were buried with people, and so they were they were intentionally put in places out of the way where they wouldn't get broken, where people weren't farming or herding their livestock, and so they are well preserved. Yeah, and again, I think the design looks very contemporary and modern. Yes.
Is there much collaboration between the various pueblos, such as Santa Clara, where a lot of the black pottery
Mm-hmm.
is also done with different style?
Collaboration among artists at different pueblos? Not that I know of. The different pueblos all have their own sort of style, and most people want to keep it that way. So at Santa Clara, you do get a lot of the black polished ware and carving. Artists like Margaret Tafoya and members of her family are really well known, not only for polished blackware, but for carving the designs instead of painting them. And so each pueblo, each community, and oftentimes each family has their technique or their design element or their style that they're known for. So you don't get a lot of collaboration. Yes, sir.
What's your take on the change in your signatures?
We were talking about signatures earlier, and before Maria and Julian became so famous for their black on black wear, no Pueblo potter signed their work. They just didn't. You wouldn't know whose work it was. You might know it's from Santa Clara Pueblo because it's polished and carved, or it's San Ildefonso because it's polychrome, it looks like this. But Maria became so well known for her work that she started signing it. Everybody wanted a Maria pot. Well, that caused some problems for her and her family in their community, where conformity is really what's best, and keeping the peace. And if somebody gets to be more famous and more rich and perhaps is perceived as being more proud or too proud to be a part of the community, that caused a lot of strife. And so in order to appease some of her neighbors who were also potters and maybe weren't getting good prices for their work, Maria started signing their work as well. So you may have a pot that is Maria's signature, but it doesn't necessarily mean it was made by Maria. Now that sort of practice is not done anymore, but I think it's an interesting moment in time, because she was the first Pueblo woman to become known individually for her work. And her signature did change over time. It was, early on it was Marie or Marie Poveca, which was her maiden name. And then whoever she collaborated with, her husband Julian or her son Popova Day, and her signature changed over time. And she also signed pieces that weren't hers, as I said, to help kind of keep the peace within the community. Sometimes you can date the pots based on the signature, whether it's Marie or Maria, and Poveca versus Martinez, or just Maria. And there are people who are experts on that. I'm not one of them, but I know you have to look very carefully, and you can't always take, it might be her signature, but as I said, it may not be her pot. Yes?
Is Tony Day still alive? And would you tell the story of his life and his history and what happened to him?
Tony Day is no longer alive. He died in, I believe it was February or early March of 2008. He was very dynamic personality. Again, he'd grown up in this family of artists. He made pottery. He became a painter as well, sort of moving out of that family legacy. Incredible potential and creativity, and he was in a serious motorcycle or car accident in the early 1980s, which left him injured and really unable to continue his art career. So from that time until 2008, he was really not able to create anything. A couple of paintings, which you can tell that they're post-accident. And near the end of his life, he really was primarily an invalid. He wasn't able to move around at all. So that accident cut short his career, and to some degree cut short his life as well. But yes, he passed away early in 2008.
Who's the first one to put turquoise into the pottery?
That's right. As I said, each subsequent generation kind of added their own technique and twist on it. I told you about Popova Day and this overfiring with blow torches. And Tony Day, one of the things that he did to sort of, well, I'm going to show my dad, I'm not only going to use that blowtorch, I'm going to start etching things, and then I'm going to inlay it with turquoise and heishi, very tiny beads carved out of shell. Olivella shell, where you get these shades of brown and beige. You might often see multiple strands, string necklaces with multiple strings of these heishi beads. And Tony also would inlay that into his pottery. And sometimes even added silver, too. So he was incredibly creative. In fact, the exhibition that was just in Santa Fe was called Creative Spark, the art and life of Tony Day. So he was a potter, he was a painter, he was a silversmith, lapidary, working with stones and shell. I mean, he just had this incredible vibrancy to him. And so to have his career cut short by this accident was devastating for him and for the family. His son, Jared Day, as I said, is a painter and draftsman, lives with his family just outside of Seattle in Washington State. Well, I hope you do go take another look at the exhibition again with fresh eyes, and thank you very much.